Echoes of Courage by Peter Lamb. Chapter 1, The Silent Invitation. The Groombridge Commonwealth Cemetery lay cradled in the embrace of ancient pines, their willowy whispers harmonizing with the gentle rustle of leaves. It was a place of serene solitude, where rows of gravestones stood as sentinels of history, each marking the final resting place of souls who had once walked upon this earth. The air was crisp, tinged with a hint of nostalgia, an ever-present reminder of lives lived and lost. I hadn't come here by accident. In my hands I clutched a weathered letter, the edges frayed from years of careful handling. It had been my grandfather's, a relic of the past, detailing a promise made to a fallen friend, a soldier buried somewhere in these very grounds. The letter had been found among my grandfather's belongings after he passed, and though he had never spoken of his wartime experiences, I knew now that they had haunted him. The name on the gravestone was what I sought. As I wandered through the hallowed grounds, my footsteps echoed lightly against the gravel paths. I scanned each headstone, searching, feeling the weight of time pressing upon me. And then I saw him. A solitary figure sat on a weathered park bench beneath the boughs of an ancient oak. He blended into the cemetery as though he belonged to it, as though he had always been there, waiting for someone to notice him. He was an old man, his features nondescript yet captivating, as though time had etched its essence into every crease and contour of his face. His posture was relaxed yet dignified, his hands folded in his lap, fingers worn with age. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging me with a nod. His eyes held a depth that made my breath catch, like looking into the past itself. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady, woven with something deeper than mere greeting, an invitation, a whisper of stories waiting to be told. "Good afternoon," I replied, drawn inexplicably to the gravity of his presence. "It's a peaceful place, isn't it?" He nodded, casting his gaze over the endless rows of stone markers. "Peaceful indeed. These grounds hold more than memories, they hold echoes of what once was." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I hesitated, then held up the letter in my hands. "I'm looking for someone," I admitted. "A soldier buried here. My grandfather wrote about him." The old man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Tell me the name," he said. I unfolded the letter, my fingers tracing the inked words. "Private Henry Collins," I read aloud. The cemetery seemed to still around us. The old man exhaled slowly. "Collins," he murmured, as if tasting the name. Then he looked at me with something close to recognition. "I knew him," he said. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could speak, he gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. "Sit," he said. "I'll tell you about Henry Collins." Chapter 2, Before the War. I lowered myself onto the bench, my pulse quickening. The weight of the moment settled in as I sat beside the old man, the cemetery stretching before us like a sea of silent witnesses. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees. "Henry Collins," he murmured again, as if summoning memories long buried. "We weren't just comrades in war, we were friends long before that. We grew up together in Sussex, two boys with the world at our feet, before it all changed." His voice had a lilt of nostalgia, the kind that accompanies memories both treasured and painful. "Henry was the dreamer between us," he continued. "Always looking ahead, always talking about places he wanted to go. France, Italy, even America. He wanted to see it all. He had this wild idea about becoming a writer. Said he was going to travel the world and send back stories of places no one had ever seen." The old man chuckled softly, but he was hopeless at writing. Could never sit still long enough to put pen to paper. He'd start a dozen stories and never finish one. I smiled, imagining the boy he described. "What about you?" I asked. He exhaled, as if considering the question carefully. "Me? I was the sensible one, the one who kept him grounded. We worked together on my father's farm. Hard labor, but it kept food on the table. We spent our evenings down by the river, fishing, or just talking about things that boys talk about. Who could run the fastest? Who could climb the tallest tree? Back then, war was something that happened to other people, not to us." A silence settled between us, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with the weight of remembrance. "Did he ever get to travel before the war?" I asked. The old man sighed. "No, the war came too soon. The dreams we had, places he wanted to go, they all faded the moment we enlisted. He thought it would be an adventure at first, said we'd see France together at last. He turned his gaze toward the gravestones. We did see France, but not the way we imagined. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery. I felt the weight of history pressing down on us, and for the first time, I wondered if my grandfather had known Henry before the war, if their paths had crossed in the years before Normandy. The old man's expression darkened slightly. We both thought we'd come home. His voice was heavy, thick with something unspoken. I hesitated, then asked, "How did you both end up enlisting?" The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now that," he said, "is a story of its own." Chapter 3, The Call to Arms. The old man leaned back against the bench, staring out over the cemetery as if watching the past unfold before his eyes. "We enlisted willingly," he said at last, his voice tinged with a bittersweet edge. "Not because we had to, not because we were pressured, but because we wanted to." I studied his face, waiting for him to continue. "It was 1940, he said. "We were 19. The world was on fire, and every day the newspapers told stories of the Blitz, of France falling, of the enemy moving like a storm across Europe. Sussex was far from the worst of it, but we could see the war creeping closer. The older men talked about how it felt like the Great War all over again. But to us, it was exciting. It felt like history was calling us, and we wanted to be part of it." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Henry was the one who decided first. He came to me one day, grinning like a fool, and said, 'Tom, we've got to do this. We can't sit here and watch the world burn while others fight for it.' And you know what? I agreed. We thought we'd have an adventure. We thought we'd be heroes." I hesitated before asking, "Did you tell your families?" The old man, Tom, chuckled dryly. "Not at first. We were afraid they'd try to stop us. But word got out quick in a town like ours. Henry's mother cried, begged him not to go. My father, he just nodded and said, 'If you're going to do it right.' And that was that. We took the train to London, signed up with the Royal Sussex Regiment, and the next thing we knew, we were in training." He let out a long breath, and that's when we realized war wasn't going to be the adventure we imagined. The air around us grew heavier, as if the past itself had settled into the cemetery, pressing down upon us. "You don't know what war is until you hold a rifle in your hands and march for miles in boots that don't fit," he said. "Until you see boys just like you collapse from exhaustion before they've even fired a shot." His fingers traced the armrest of the bench absent-mindedly. But Henry never lost that spark. Even when we were wading through mud up to our knees, even when we spent freezing nights in barracks, he kept talking about the future. He'd say, "Tom, when this is over, we'll go to Paris, not as soldiers, but as travelers. And you'll see, mate, we'll drink wine and dance with French girls and laugh about all this." He fell silent for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. I swallowed hard. "Did you believe him?" Tom turned to me, his eyes sad but certain. I wanted to. The last of the sunlight disappeared behind the trees, and I realized I was gripping the letter in my lap a little too tightly. "Training ended," he said finally, "and then we were sent to France." He didn't need to say more. I already knew what came next. Chapter 4, Baptism by Fire. Tom's face grew distant, as if he were no longer sitting beside me on the weathered bench, but back in the fields of France, surrounded by the deafening roar of war. "When we landed in France," he began, "it was nothing like the stories we had been told. No grand welcome, no trumpets of glory, just the cold slap of the wind, the weight of our gear, and the knowledge that we were marching toward something none of us truly understood." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "But the first real battle, that was where we learned the truth of war." The cemetery seemed to quiet around us as he spoke, as if even the trees were listening. "It was a village called Villers-Bocage," Tom continued. "Just a name on a map before we got there, but by the time we left, it was burned into our bones. We had orders to push forward and secure the town. Seemed simple enough. Clear the streets, hold position, wait for reinforcements. But the enemy wasn't going to let us take it without a fight." His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bench. "They were waiting for us," he said grimly. "The moment we set foot in that town, hell came down on us." I could almost hear it in his voice, the staccato of machine gun fire, the deafening crashes of artillery shells. We were advancing along the main road, Henry just a few steps ahead of me, when the first shot rang out. A sniper. The man beside Henry dropped before we even realized what had happened. Then all hell broke loose. Bullets ricocheting off stone, men shouting orders, the air thick with dust and smoke. We scrambled for cover, barely able to see through the chaos. He paused, as if the memory was too heavy to carry all at once. We were pinned down behind a crumbled stone wall, he continued after a moment. Henry was beside me, reloading his rifle, his hands steady in a way that didn't make sense. I remember looking at him and realizing that the fear I felt, gut-wrenching, bone-deep terror, wasn't in his eyes. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he refused to let it control him. Tom swallowed, his throat working against old emotions. He turned to me and grinned, even with all that madness around us, and said, "Guess we're not getting to Paris anytime soon, are we?" A bitter smile touched his lips. That was Henry, always finding something to hold on to, even when everything was falling apart. I leaned forward, drawn into the scene as if I had been there myself. "What happened next?" I asked. Tom's expression darkened. We had no choice but to push forward. The longer we waited, the more men we'd lose. Orders came down and we ran for the next line of cover. That's when the real fighting started. Close combat, house to house. The kind of fighting that stays with you long after the war is over. He clenched his hands together, his knuckles white. I remember stepping into a ruined cafe, the walls blasted apart, glass crunching under my boots. There was movement in the corner, an enemy soldier, no older than us, fumbling with his weapon. I raised my rifle before he could, and he trailed off. "You shot him," I murmured. Tom nodded, his gaze far away. "The first time you take a life, something inside you changes, and once it's gone, you never quite get it back." A long silence stretched between us. "Henry was different," Tom said finally. "He never talked about the men he killed, never let it define him. He just kept moving forward, kept looking ahead. But I know it weighed on him. We all carried ghosts." The wind whispered through the gravestones, stirring the fallen leaves at our feet. "And then," Tom said quietly, "came the moment that changed everything." Chapter 5. The Moment That Changed Everything. Tom exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together, as if trying to shake the cold from his bones. But I knew it wasn't the cold of the evening air that chilled him. It was the memory. "We were still in Villers-Bocage," he began, "still fighting for every inch of ground. The enemy wasn't giving up, and neither were we." He turned to me, his eyes clouded with something old and heavy. "That's when it happened." I leaned forward, bracing myself. "We were moving through a narrow alley," he continued, his voice steady but laced with the weight of recollection. "The Germans had retreated further into the town, but we knew they were still there waiting. We took it slow, step by step, rifles ready. Henry was just ahead of me, same as always. His fingers clenched slightly, as if gripping an invisible rifle. I heard it before I saw it, the sharp crack of a rifle. Just one shot." Tom's jaw tightened. Henry made a sound, a gasp, like all the air had been punched out of him. Then he crumpled, right there in the middle of the alley. My stomach twisted. "I ran to him," Tom said, his voice suddenly thick. "Didn't think, didn't care about cover, just ran. I grabbed his uniform and pulled him behind a stack of rubble, while bullets tore into the walls around us. He was clutching his side, blood already staining his fingers. I could see it in my mind, the alleyway filled with smoke, the crack of gunfire, Tom desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "He was still conscious," Tom murmured, "barely. His face had gone pale, but he looked at me and God, I'll never forget what he said." Tom swallowed hard before continuing. He grinned up at me, grinned, for God's sake, and said, "Well, Tom, looks like I'm sitting out the rest of the war." I let out a shaky breath. He was still joking? "That was Henry," Tom said, a small broken smile on his lips, always trying to make it easier for everyone else, even when he was the one bleeding out in the dirt. He rubbed a hand across his face. I pressed down on the wound, told him to hold on. He just nodded and said, "Don't let them leave me here." The wind whispered through the cemetery, rustling the leaves, as if the spirits around us were listening. "We had medics with us," Tom continued. "They got to him fast. I held onto his hand while they worked, while they wrapped bandages around him and did everything they could. He was still conscious when they carried him away. I thought he'd be okay." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I thought I'd see him again." I felt my throat tighten. "But you didn't." Tom shook his head. "I didn't." A long silence stretched between us. "He was alive when they loaded him onto the medical truck," he said quietly. "That was the last time I saw him." I looked down at the letter in my hands, the letter my grandfather had kept all his life. "What happened after that?" I asked gently. Tom's fingers curled against his knee. "That," he said, "is where the story gets complicated." Chapter 6. The Weight of Survival. Tom was silent for a long time, his gaze lost among the rows of gravestones. I didn't press him. Some memories take time to resurface, especially the ones that never truly fade. "I thought he'd be all right," he said finally. I kept telling myself that. Wounds weren't always a death sentence, not with the medics we had. And Henry, he was strong. His fingers tightened around the armrest of the bench. "But the war didn't stop for him," he continued. "It didn't stop for any of us. After they carried him away, we had to keep moving. Orders came down. We were pushing deeper into enemy territory. We fought through the town, house by house, street by street. I don't remember much of it. Not really. Just flashes, gunfire, shouting, the smell of burning buildings. I was fighting, but I wasn't there. Not really." I could see it in my mind, Tom moving forward with the others, but his thoughts were with Henry, wondering if he was still breathing, if he'd made it to a field hospital, if he was lying in a bed somewhere, waiting to come home. "But there was no word," he said, his voice quieter now. "Days passed. We kept moving, kept fighting, but no one knew anything about Henry. Every time I saw a medic, I asked, 'Did you hear about Private Collins, the one who was shot in Villers-Bocage?' Some shook their heads, others just looked away." His expression darkened. "That was when I knew." A lump formed in my throat. "You knew he didn't make it?" Tom let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Not for sure, not then, but I knew how these things went. If he had survived, someone would have told me. They would have sent word, or he would have written. But there was nothing." He looked at me then, and there was something raw in his gaze. "Do you know what it's like to lose someone and not even know when it happened? To wonder if they died alone, if they were scared, if they called out for you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "That's what ate at me," he said. "Not just losing him, but not knowing. I fought for weeks after that, carrying that weight, waiting for some kind of confirmation. And when it finally came," his jaw clenched, "it came in the form of a single sentence. 'Private Henry Collins killed in action.' That was it. No details, no explanation, just gone." A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the wind shifting through the cemetery. "War is strange," he murmured. "It teaches you how to keep moving forward, even when your heart is stuck in the past." I hesitated, then asked, "Did you ever find out what really happened?" Tom was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I did," he admitted, "but not for a long time." He turned to me, and for the first time I saw something else in his expression, something that looked almost like hesitation. "The truth," he said, "wasn't what I expected." Chapter 7. The Official Report. Tom exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself before diving into something deep and dark. "The official report came through weeks after Henry was listed as killed in action," he said. "By then, we had moved far beyond Villers-Bocage. The war was still raging, and there was no time to grieve, no time to stop and think. But when I finally got my hands on that report, I thought, maybe, just maybe, it would give me some kind of closure." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I was wrong." I watched as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the creases deep and permanent, as if it had been opened and read 1,000 times over. "It wasn't long," he said, glancing at the yellowed page before handing it to me. "Just a few sentences. That's all a man's life was worth on paper." I took the paper hesitantly, my eyes scanning the typewritten words. "Private Henry Collins, Royal Sussex Regiment. Date of injury, June 14, 1944. Location, Villers-Bocage, France. Status, evacuated to field hospital. Date of death, June 15, 1944. Cause, severe blood loss due to a gunshot wound to the abdomen." I swallowed hard, the reality of it settling into my bones. "They got him to a hospital," I murmured. Tom nodded. "They did, and for a long time, that's all I knew. He was alive when they took him, and the next day, he was gone." There was something about the simplicity of it that made it harder to accept. A man who had once been full of life and dreams, reduced to a list of facts, his last moments documented in cold ink. "I read that report over and over," Tom said, trying to make sense of it, trying to picture him lying in that hospital, wondering if he was alone, if anyone was with him when he went, if he was afraid. I clenched the paper in my hands. "Did it bring you any peace?" Tom shook his head. "Not a bit. If anything, it made it worse. Because I knew Henry. I knew how he fought to survive, how he never gave up. And yet I had no idea what those last hours were like. No idea if he fought to the end, or if he just slipped away." The wind rustled the leaves around us, the soft hush of nature the only thing filling the silence. "But that wasn't the whole truth," Tom continued, his voice lower now. "Not by a long shot." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Tom leaned forward, his fingers interlocked. "It took me years, decades even, to find out what really happened to Henry. And when I finally did," he shook his head, "it changed everything." I gripped the letter in my hands, my pulse quickening. "What did you find out?" Tom looked at me, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't just a simple case of dying in a hospital bed," he said. "There was more to it, much more." Chapter 8. The Nurse's Truth. Tom's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of the bench as he stared out over the gravestones. The weight of his next words settled into the quiet space between us, stretching the moment before he finally spoke. "It was years later," he said. "Decades, really. I had long since left the army, tried to build a life, but Henry's death never left me. I thought about him every day, wondered about those last hours, and then one day, by complete chance, I found someone who had been there." I held my breath. "A nurse," Tom said. "Her name was Margaret Whitmore. I met her at a remembrance service in London. She was elderly by then, in her 70s, but she still carried herself like a woman who had seen everything and survived it." He paused, as if recalling their first meeting. "I overheard her talking to someone about Villers-Bocage," he continued. "It stopped me in my tracks. That name, it never left me." I turned to her and asked if she had been there during the war. She gave me this long look, like she was trying to decide if I was worth talking to. And then she nodded. I could already feel the tension tightening in my chest. "I asked her if she had been at the field hospital in June 1944, Tom said, and she just stared at me, a long, knowing stare. Then she said, 'Who are you looking for?' I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. 'And you told her?' Tom nodded. I said, 'Private Henry Collins. He was brought in with a gunshot wound to the abdomen.' His hands clenched slightly. And then, Margaret, she closed her eyes, like she was bracing herself. And when she opened them again, she told me everything. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the trees, but neither of us moved. She remembered him, Tom said. After all those years, she remembered Henry, and not just as another wounded soldier. She remembered him because of what happened that night. I swallowed. What happened? Tom exhaled slowly. She told me Henry should have survived. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I asked. Tom's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. She said he was conscious when they brought him in. Weak, but awake. He was talking. She remembered because he asked her to write a letter for her. I felt my grip tighten on the bench. A letter? Tom nodded. To his mother. Margaret wrote down every word he said, promising her that he was going to be okay, that he'd be home soon. He made her swear she'd send it. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to imagine it, Henry, lying on a cot in that field hospital, fighting to stay strong. But she never sent the letter, Tom continued. She never had the chance. I looked up sharply. Why? Tom's expression darkened. Because Henry didn't die from his wound, at least not right away. The hospital was overwhelmed. More wounded kept coming in, dozens by the hour. The doctors were struggling to keep up, and at some point during the chaos, Henry was moved to another tent, a quieter one. He was stable, weak, but stable. A sick feeling crept into my stomach. What happened to him? Tom looked at me, his voice quiet but firm. He was left there, forgotten. The words echoed in my ears. Margaret told me that when she went back to check on him, it was hours later. The tent was dark, quiet, and Henry? Tom swallowed hard. Henry was still there, but he was gone. I didn't speak. I couldn't. She said the doctors had been too overwhelmed, Tom murmured, that they never came back for him. His wound was bad, But if they had given him the right care, he might have made it. Instead, he just slipped away, alone. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "She never forgave herself," Tom said. "She told me she kept his letter for years, never able to throw it away. She even offered it to me, but I couldn't take it." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "You mean Henry's last words to his mother were still written down somewhere?" Tom nodded, his eyes glistening with something unreadable. "Somewhere out there? Yes." A wave of emotions crashed over me. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a truth that had been hidden for decades, a message lost in time. And suddenly, I knew. This wasn't just Henry's story. This was my grandfather's story, too. Chapter 9, The Search for Henry's Letter. Tom's words settled into the silence between us, their weight pressing down like the heavy sky before a storm. Somewhere out there, Henry's last words, his final thoughts, his hope, were still written down, lost in time. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "Did Margaret tell you what she did with the letter?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "She kept it for decades," he said. "She told me she couldn't bear to throw it away, but she didn't know what to do with it either. It was a promise she had failed to keep." "Where is it now?" I asked. Tom exhaled. "She gave it to a war archive." I sat up straighter. "An archive?" He nodded. "Somewhere in London. Margaret said she donated a collection of old wartime materials years ago. Letters, notes, medical logs. She wasn't sure if the letter was still among them, but she hoped someone might find it one day." A flicker of hope stirred in my chest. "Then we can find it." Tom gave me a small, weary smile. "That's a big if. War archives aren't the easiest things to sort through, and we don't even know exactly where it ended up. But we know it exists," I said, my determination hardening. "And if it exists, I want to find it." Tom studied me for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "All right, let's find it." The next day, I found myself standing outside the Imperial War Museum archives in London. Tom had insisted on coming with me, though he moved slower now, the years weighing on him in a way that made my chest tighten. We had called ahead, explaining what we were looking for. The archivist, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, had been skeptical but willing to help. "We received thousands of documents," he had said over the phone. "If it was cataloged, it's possible we can track it down. But if it was part of a bulk donation, it might not be easy to locate." Still, I wasn't leaving without trying. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, a tangible weight of history pressing against the walls. Shelves stretched high, lined with worn folders, yellowed papers, and fragile letters from soldiers long gone. Tom and I were led to a small table, where a clerk set down several boxes marked medical records. "Field Hospitals, 1944. "This is where we'd expect to find it," he said, "but I can't promise it's in here." I nodded, swallowing hard. "We'll look." Tom's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the first folder. I took a deep breath and followed suit, carefully leafing through pages of typed reports, handwritten medical notes, casualty lists. Time blurred as we searched, and then my fingers froze. At the bottom of a folder labeled Personal Effects, Villers-Bocage, a small yellowed envelope rested among the brittle papers. My breath caught in my throat as I turned it over. It was addressed in shaky handwriting. "Mrs. Collins, West Sussex, England." Tom sucked in a sharp breath beside me. "That's it," he whispered. Hands trembling, I carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of aged paper. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. I swallowed hard and began to read. "Dear Mum, I don't want you to worry. I took a bit of a knock today, but I'm all right. The medics are taking good care of me, and they say I'll be up on my feet again soon. You always said I was too stubborn to stay down for long, and I reckon you were right. Tell Dad not to let the fields go to ruin while I'm away, and make sure Tommy doesn't steal my boots before I get back home. I'll be home soon, Mum. I promise. Love, Henry." I pressed my lips together, my throat burning. Tom wiped his eyes, his voice thick with emotion. He really thought he'd make it. I folded the letter carefully, holding it as if it were something fragile, something sacred. "This should have made it home," I whispered. Tom nodded. "But it didn't. And now, after all these years, what do we do with it?" I exhaled, staring down at the letter. Henry's final words, the last piece of his story. And now I had the choice of what to do next. Chapter 10. Delivering the letter. The train ride back to Sussex was quiet. Tom sat beside me, staring out the window, lost in thought. The letter rested in my hands, its weight far heavier than the paper it was written on. Henry Collins had written this letter nearly 80 years ago, believing it would reach his mother. It never had. And now it was my responsibility to deliver it, to bring Henry's final words home. Tom shifted beside me, clearing his throat. "You sure about this?" I nodded. "It's the right thing to do." His gaze drifted to the folded letter. "If there's anyone left to give it to." That was the question, wasn't it? After all these years, was there still a Collins family in Sussex? We had done some research before leaving London, scouring public records for any trace of Henry's relatives. His parents were long gone, that much was certain. His father had passed away in the 1960s, his mother a few years later. But there had been a brother, Thomas Collins. Henry had mentioned him in the letter. "Make sure Tommy doesn't steal my boots before I get back home." If Tommy had been younger than Henry, he might still be alive. Or maybe he had children. Maybe someone in the Collins family was still waiting for a part of Henry to come home. We arrived in West Sussex just as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. The village where Henry had grown up was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. As we walked down the quiet streets, I couldn't help but wonder how much had changed since Henry had left for war. Eventually, we found our way to a modest house on the edge of town, where public records had listed Thomas Collins Jr., Henry's nephew. Tom hesitated at the gate, his fingers gripping the wood. "You want me to do the talking?" I shook my head. "I think it should be you." He nodded slowly. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and knocked on the door. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 70s with sharp blue eyes that reminded me of the old black-and-white photograph of Henry we had found in the archives. "Yes?" the man said, eyeing us warily. Tom cleared his throat. "Are you Thomas Collins Jr.?" the man frowned. "I am. Who's asking?" Tom glanced at me, then back at him. "My name's Tom, and I served with your uncle, Henry Collins." For a long moment, the man didn't move. His expression remained guarded, skeptical. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I know," Tom said quietly, "but there's something of his that was lost, and we think it should be returned to your family." I carefully stepped forward and held out the letter. Thomas eyed it for a long moment, his brow furrowing. Then, hesitantly, he reached for it, his fingers brushing over the fragile paper. He unfolded it slowly, his gaze scanning the words. As he read, his face changed, his mouth tightening, his eyes glistening with something raw and painful. When he reached the last line, "I'll be home soon, Mum. I promise," he exhaled sharply and looked up at us. "My grandmother never stopped waiting for this," he said, his voice rough. "Even when she knew deep down that he wasn't coming home, she never stopped hoping that something would come, that someone would tell her what happened." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "She should have had this letter." Thomas nodded, his fingers tightening around the paper. "Thank you," he murmured, "for bringing it home." Tom exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as if a weight had finally lifted. For the first time since we'd started this journey, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Peace. Epilogue, a promise kept. A few months later, I stood beside Tom once more at Groombridge Commonwealth Cemetery, the autumn wind rustling through the trees. Henry's grave was marked with the same simple stone as all the others, his name carved into the weathered surface. Thomas Collins Jr. had decided that Henry's letter should be preserved, not just as a private keepsake, but as part of history. He had donated it to a museum, ensuring that Henry's last words, his hope, his promise would never be forgotten again. As Tom and I stood in silence, I thought back to the first time I had met him on this very bench. So much had changed. He had told me Henry's story, and now it would never be lost again. I glanced at Tom. "You think he knows?" Tom gave a small smile, his gaze on Henry's name. "Aye," he said, "I think he does." The wind whispered through the cemetery, and for the first time it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like home. The end.